James sat at the kitchen table, the divorce papers spread out in front of him like a battlefield map. His fingers traced the edges of the documents, the weight of the decision pressing down on his chest. He had never imagined it would come to this. Not like this. The sound of Sarah's keys jingling in the hallway made him stiffen. He hadn't seen her in weeks, not since she'd moved out. The door creaked open, and there she stood, her round belly a stark reminder of what they had lost, or rather, what she had thrown away. "James," she said softly, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" He didn't look up. "We need to talk." Sarah hesitated, then stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She moved slowly, her hand resting on her stomach as if to protect it, from him, or from the truth, he wasn't sure. She sat across from him, her eyes searching his face for answers he wasn't ready to give. "I've signed the papers," he said finally, pushing them toward her. "It's over." Her breath hitched. "James, please. We can work through this. I made a mistake, but A mistake?" he interrupted, his voice sharp. "Sarah, you didn't make a mistake. You had an affair. With your doctor. How long did you think you could keep that from me?" She flinched, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't plan for it to happen. It just did." "Just did?" He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Do you have any idea what this has done to me? To us? You were carrying our child, or so I thought. And now I find out it's his?" She looked away, her cheeks red with shame. "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix this, Sarah." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I trusted you. I loved you. And you threw it all away." She reached for his hand, but he pulled back. "Please, James. I know I hurt you, but I still love you. We can fix this. We can start over." He shook his head. "It's too late for that. The trust is gone. And I can't raise a child that isn't mine." Tears streamed down her face as she pleaded with him. "But the baby needs a father. I need you." "You gave that up when you chose him," he said coldly. "You made your bed, Sarah. Now you have to lie in it." She sobbed, clutching her stomach as if it would somehow make him stay. "I never meant to hurt you. I was scared. I didn't know what to do." "You could have talked to me," he said, his voice softer now. "We could have worked through it together. But instead, you ran to him." She wiped her tears, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just about the affair, James. There's more to it." He frowned. "What are you talking about?" She hesitated, then pulled out her phone and slid it across the table. "Look at this." Confused, he picked up the phone and opened the photo gallery. The first image made his blood run cold. It was a screenshot of a text conversation between Sarah and her doctor, Dr. Mark Harris. The messages were incriminating, to say the least. "Mark. I've been thinking about you. About us. Sarah, me too. I can't stop thinking about that night. Mark, neither can I." The messages went on, each one more explicit than the last. James felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had known about the affair, but seeing it laid out like this, it was too much. "How could you do this?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "I told you, it's not just about the affair," she said, her tone desperate. "Mark, he's not what you think." "Oh, really?" James snapped. "Because from where I'm sitting, he's just another man who couldn't keep it in his pants." "No," she insisted. "It's more than that. He has a secret. Something I think you need to know." James narrowed his eyes. "What kind of secret?" She hesitated again, as if unsure whether to continue. "Mark, he's not just a doctor. He's involved in something dangerous." James leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "What are you talking about?" "I don't know all the details," she admitted. "But I've seen things. He's into some shady stuff. And I think he's using his position at the hospital to cover it up. James's heart pounded. What kind of shady stuff? She shook her head. I don't know. But I'm scared, James. I think he might be dangerous. He stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. And you're just now telling me this? I didn't want to involve you, she said, her voice trembling. But now, I don't know what to do. James exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. This is a mess, Sarah. A complete mess. I know, she whispered. But I need your help. I can't do this on my own. He looked at her, his emotions warring within him. She had hurt him, betrayed him in the worst way possible. But now she was asking for his help. And despite everything, he couldn't turn his back on her. What do you want me to do? He asked finally. She reached for his hand again, and this time, he didn't pull away. I need you to help me figure out what he's up to. And if he's as dangerous as I think, we need to stop him. James sighed, his mind spinning. This is insane, Sarah. Do you understand that? I know, she said, tears in her eyes. But I don't have anyone else to turn to. He looked at her, at the woman he had once loved more than anything, and felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was the remnants of the love they had shared. Whatever it was enough to make him nod. Fine, he said. But this doesn't mean I forgive you. And it doesn't mean we're getting back together. I know, she whispered. Thank you. He stood, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. We'll start with the hospital. See if we can find out what he's been up to. She nodded, relief washing over her face. Thank you, James. I know I don't deserve this. He didn't respond. He couldn't. Instead, he turned and headed for the door, his mind already racing with the implications of what they were about to do. This wasn't just about uncovering the doctor's secret anymore. It was about protecting the woman he had once called his wife, and the child she was carrying, even if it wasn't his. As he stepped out into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only. James sat in his car outside the hospital, the engine idling as he stared at the building. The fluorescent lights from the windows cast an eerie glow against the darkened sky. He hadn't slept much since the confrontation with Sarah, his mind racing with questions about Dr. Harris and the tangled mess they were about to step into. He took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. This is it, he thought. No turning back now. He grabbed the small notepad he'd brought with him and stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at his skin. The hospital was quieter at night, the usual bustle reduced to the occasional hum of a passing intercom. James moved through the corridors with purpose, his footsteps echoing softly against the tiled floor. He'd done some digging beforehand and knew Dr. Harris's office was on the 3rd floor. As he approached the elevator, he noticed a figure standing near the vending machine, a nurse in scrubs, her head bowed as she rummaged through her bag. James hesitated, then decided to take a chance. Excuse me, he said, his voice low but firm. I'm looking for Dr. Harris's office. Could you point me in the right direction? The nurse glanced up, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. Dr. Harris? He's not here right now. His office is on the 3rd floor, though. Down the hall to the left. James nodded, offering a small smile. Thanks. I'll just leave a note for him. The nurse didn't respond, already turning back to her bag. James stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 3rd floor, his heart pounding in his chest. This is insane, he thought. What am I even looking for? The door slid open, and he stepped out into the hallway. It was even quieter up here, the only sound the faint hum of the overhead lighting. He followed the nurse's directions, finding Dr. Harris's office at the end of the hall. The door was closed, but the light was on. James hesitated, then knocked softly. No response. He tried the handle, and to his surprise, it turned easily. He pushed the door open, stepping inside. The office was meticulously clean, the walls lined with diplomas and medical certifications. A large desk sat in the center of the room, its surface cluttered with papers and folders. James moved closer, his eyes scanning the room. He picked up a file from the desk, flipping through the pages. It was a patient record, but the name had been redacted. He frowned, setting it aside and reaching for another. As he sifted through the papers, something caught his eye. A small, leather-bound journal tucked beneath a stack of folders. He pulled it out, opening it to the first page. The handwriting was neat but hurried, the pages filled with notes and observations. James's eyes widened as he read. Dr. Harris had been documenting his interactions with patients in detail, but there was something off about the entries. The language was clinical, but there was an undertone of something else, a fascination, almost an obsession. He flipped through the pages, his breath catching as he reached a section marked Sarah. Subject: Sarah Montgomery. Observed symptoms: emotional instability, heightened sensitivity, signs of dependency. Notes: her vulnerability makes her particularly susceptible to suggestion. Further exploration required. James felt a chill run down his spine. This isn't just an affair, he realized. He's been manipulating her. He set the journal aside, his hands trembling. He needed to find more, something concrete he could use to expose Harris. He moved to the filing cabinet, pulling open the top drawer. It was filled with more patient records, each one meticulously organized. As he rifled through the files, he noticed a small, unmarked envelope tucked in the back. He pulled it out, tearing it open. Inside was a collection of photographs, some of Sarah, but others of different women. Each photo was accompanied by a note, written in the same clinical hand as the journal. James felt a surge of anger. This isn't just unethical. It's criminal. He was so focused on the photos that he didn't hear the door open behind him. "Can I help you?" James froze, his blood running cold. He turned slowly to see Dr. Harris standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. James stammered, his mind racing. "I thought I left something here." Dr. Harris stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "And what exactly would that be?" James swallowed hard, clutching the envelope in his hand. "Look, I know what's going on here. This isn't just about Sarah, is it? You've been manipulating her, maybe others too." Dr. Harris smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You think you've uncovered some grand conspiracy, don't you? Let me guess, Sarah sent you here. She's always been so dramatic." James took a step back, his heart pounding. "Stay away from her. I'll make sure everyone knows what you've been doing." Dr. Harris laughed, a low, humorless sound. "And who's going to believe you? A jealous ex-husband with no evidence? You have no idea what you're dealing with." James clenched his fists, his anger boiling over. "I'm not going to let you hurt her, or anyone else." Dr. Harris's smile faded, his eyes cold and calculating. "You're in over your head, Mr. Montgomery. I suggest you leave now, before this gets out of hand." James hesitated, his mind racing. He knew he was out of his depth, but he couldn't just walk away. "Not now." "I'm not leaving," he said, his voice steady. "Not without proof." Dr. Harris's expression hardened. "Then I'm afraid you've made a very poor choice." James's eyes widened as the doctor reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a syringe. "What are you doing?" he demanded, taking another step back. Dr. Harris advanced, his calm demeanor unsettling. "You've seen too much. I can't let you leave with that information." James's heart raced as he realized the danger he was in. He glanced around the room, searching for an escape, but the door was blocked. "You're insane," he said, his voice trembling. "You really think you can get away with this?" Dr. Harris smiled again, his grip tightening around the syringe. "I already have." James made a split-second decision, lunging for the desk and grabbing the heavy stapler. He swung it wildly, but Dr. Harris sidestepped easily, his movements calm and deliberate. "You're only making this harder on yourself," the doctor said, his voice almost pitying. James's mind raced. He needed to think fast. He feigned another attack, but this time he aimed for the door, slamming into it and twisting the handle. The door flew open, and James bolted into the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear Dr. Harris's footsteps behind him, but he didn't dare look back. He reached the elevator, frantically pressing the button. The doors slid open just as Dr. Harris appeared at the end of the hall. "You can't run forever, Mr. Montgomery," the doctor called, his voice echoing through the empty corridor. James stepped into the elevator, his hands shaking as he pressed the button for the ground floor. As the doors closed, he caught a final glimpse of Dr. Harris, standing there with that same cold, calculating expression. James leaned against the wall, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He knew he was in over his head, but he also knew he couldn't stop now. Not when the stakes were this high. The elevator doors opened, and he stepped out into the lobby, the fluorescent lights blinding him momentarily. He needed to get out of here, needed to regroup and figure out his next move. As he headed for the exit, a voice behind him made him freeze. "James?" He turned to see Sarah standing there, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling. James hesitated, his mind racing. "We need to talk," he said finally. "Now." Sarah nodded, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "What's going on? Did you find something?" James glanced around, his heart still pounding. "More than I bargained for," he said grimly. "But we can't stay here. It's not safe." Sarah's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" James grabbed her arm gently but firmly. "I'll explain everything. But we need to go. Now." He led her toward the exit, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd discovered. He had no idea what they were up against, but one thing was clear, they were in way over their heads. As they stepped out into the night, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, but the street was empty. "Tell me what's going on," Sarah pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. James hesitated, his grip tightening on her arm. "It's worse than we thought," he said finally. "He's not just a manipulator, Sarah. He's dangerous. And if we're not careful, we could both end up." He stopped abruptly, his words catching in his throat. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them, growing louder with each passing second. James turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. Dr. Harris stood there, his expression calm and composed, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Leaving so soon?" the doctor asked, his voice eerily calm. "We were just getting started." James's mind raced, his eyes darting around for an escape. But before he could react, Dr. Harris reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small, metallic object. Sarah gasped, her grip on James's arm tightening. "What is that?" James's heart sank as he realized what it was, a gun. "I'm afraid our conversation isn't over," Dr. Harris said, his voice as cold as the night air. "Now, let's talk." James's stomach churned as he realized the gravity of the situation. He had no choice but to face the doctor head-on, but he had no idea how they were going to get out of this alive. As Dr. Harris advanced, James exchanged a quick glance with Sarah, his mind racing for a plan. But before he could speak, Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "Don't," she said, her eyes locked on the doctor. "You're not going to hurt him." Dr. Harris chuckled softly, his gaze shifting from James to Sarah. "Brave words, Sarah. But you're in no position to." Suddenly, Sarah lunged forward, grabbing the doctor's wrist and twisting it with all her strength. The gun clattered to the ground, and James didn't hesitate. He slammed into Dr. Harris, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. "Run," he shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her toward the car. They sprinted down the street, their footsteps echoing in the night. James could hear Dr. Harris shouting behind them, but he didn't dare look back. They reached the car, and James fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. "Get in," he yelled, shoving Sarah into the passenger seat. As he pulled away from the curb, he glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a final glimpse of Dr. Harris standing there, his face twisted with rage. James's heart raced as they sped down the empty streets, his mind spinning with the events of the last few minutes. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Somewhere safe," James replied, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "But we're not out of the woods yet." The car sped into the darkness, the city lights fading behind them. James knew they couldn't go back, not after this. But he also knew they couldn't stop. Not until they had uncovered the truth. And put an end to Dr. Harris's twisted game. As they drove into the night, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. And whatever they found, it was going to change everything.